Hey guys, Hashi here. Today I wanted to talk about a subject I feel doesn't get enough nuance in the community. That would be the verdict of the Council of Nikea, and more importantly, Leman Russ's stance on Psykers and why he actually isn't a hypocrite. For those who maybe don't know, in Warhammer during the Great Crusade, the legions of Space Marines had sanctioned battle Psykers called librarians. And this role would last until the Council of Nikea, where many of the Imperium's prominent officers and officials would make their case to the Emperor for or against the use of battle Psykers. The Emperor ended up agreeing that the use of battle psykers would be outlawed moving forward. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, would be one of the more vocal opponents to the usage of librarians, yet would keep his rune priests around. To many, this would make Russ seem like a hypocrite, however, he is not, due to the nuance of where rune priests actually draw their power from. Rune priests draw their power from the world spirit of Fenris, and this is where the controversy starts, since some people in the fandom try to pretend that world spirits do not exist. This gets to the point where some people will try to call any citations of world spirits as cope or a retcon. I don't intend to do a historical debunk of that today, but what I do intend to cover is why world spirits are real, why Russ isn't a hypocrite, and why the heresy is much more interesting this way. So with that out of the way, let's get right into the video. To address Russ's stance in this family feud, we first have to go over what the relevant parties say at the council as to properly contextualize what's being argued. In the novel A Thousand Suns, we see the testimony of a few characters firsthand, including Weirdmake, a rune priest of the Space Wolves, Mortarion, Primarch of the Death Guard, and Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. The simplest one to cover is Weirdmake, who directly accuses the Thousand Suns of unclean magic. Now this sounds simple, but we have to remember Weirdmake is himself a rune priest, and when he goes to testify, Ahriman is terrified. Not because of the notion that the Thousand Suns had been using psychic powers at this point, which was legal, but because of how they had been using them, the implication being that it was in fact unclean or unrestricted magic. We then move on to Mortarion, who goes over a history of the unchecked Psykers in the galaxy, and he explains how they have brought so much destruction in the past. Mortarion then says that while he doesn't accuse Magnus of it directly, he thinks that the road Magnus is on with a step here or there will lead to damnation. Admittedly, Mortarion is very anti-Psyker due to the history with his home planet, however his reservations are because of the historical tendencies of, say it with me now, unchecked Psykers. We then see in a short story, Demonology, that Mortarion was essentially promised by Malkador that someday all of the Psykers in the militaries of the Imperium would be gone, and that on Nikea, Mortarion would have a special role to play. This is important because in the same short story, we see that Mortarion has no issue learning how to deny and bind demons with what isn't the warp, as the warp corrupts. This is consistent with what we are told in the Buried Dagger, as hate alone doesn't make walls fall, or in this case, rebuke demons, meaning that Mortarion is informed and is not ignorant like Magnus would argue later. Mortarion ends up proving himself right in the end too, as the demon he kept shackled is in part what helps him fall to chaos, another instance of Magnus's opponents being more nuanced than just no psykers, lol. Now, not everybody who would be against the Librarius and Magnus's continued use of psychic powers would be present at the council, but we would learn their positions from a variety of sources. One such case of this would be Perturabo, where we see that he was against the use of battle psykers, but he wasn't as against it as the formerly mentioned Mortarion. For example, in Angels Exterminatus, we would see that Magnus and Perturabo would scour Terra for the lost works of the old masters. Magnus would be interested in philosophies, while Perturabo would take interest in mechanical wonders. We would then see in Magnus the Red, Master of Prospero, that Perturabo would heed the Emperor's word about not peering too deep into the warp, smashing the device Magnus had requested him to replicate that would help him navigate the Great Ocean. Perturabo also disapproved of the Librarius at this time, saying a sword without a hilt is as dangerous to the user as it is the enemy. Again, in Angel Exterminatus, Perturabo would feel that the Council of Nikea was where closed minds put a noose around Magnus's neck. In Mortis, we see exactly why he's against the use of the Librarius. During the Siege of Terra, the rampant use of demons had blinded the Lord of Iron, so he withdrew from the siege. When he is told that the other legions will attempt to stop them, Perturabo points out that they have gambled their strength for the warp, while Iron remains strong. Perturabo has a point here, since as we see in the novel A Thousand Suns, some of Magnus's legion do in fact clean their bolters with psychic powers, trading mechanical skills for psychic powers. Now that we have gone over some of the big cases against psykers, let's go over some of the people who would side with Magnus. We see in Jagatai Khan, Warhawk of Chigoris, that Sanguinius approaches the Khan about the upcoming controversy and explains that Magnus, as the foremost psyker of the Primarchs, would hold the most weight. However, he is controversial, and the opposition is made of Puritans who would not stop at their own houses being clean and insist that every house be clean. Sanguinius then explains that if the other side were to win, their psykers with rich traditions would be labeled as sorcerers. The Khan, of course, remains aloof, but for the most part agrees with Sanguinius in principle, despite never defending Magnus at the trial. In The End and the Death, Volume 1, Sanguinius would agree that psykers spreading unchecked would be a deep and destructive flaw, while also seeing navigators as a vital part to humanity's interstellar presence, yet another proof of the issue at hand really being unchecked psykers. We will now move on to what Magnus actually argues at the council. We see in A Thousand Suns that Magnus tells an abridged version of Plato's cave, that ends with the person who had left the cave digging a hole back into the cave so that the people inside cannot avoid the sun. I feel this perfectly illustrates the divide between Magnus and his brothers on this issue. While even with the most favorable interpretations, the other Primarchs were wary of what psychic powers would cause, and Magnus was insisting on everyone becoming quote-unquote enlightened. This looks even worse when you remember it was Magnus who helped form the Librarius project in the first place and integrate it into the other legions. Put yourself in Mortarion or Perturabo's shoes here for a moment and imagine you dislike sorcery for one reason or another, and then one day some of your brothers get together with the brother who leads the Psychic Legion, and they explain that each legion should not only use combat psykers but have them in dedicated roles. Then when this is called into question, that same psychic brother allegorically explains that you all should just become enlightened by exposure to blinding light. At this point, I honestly can't blame them for how they feel. Having the collected testimony of some of his sons and other high-ranking officials of the Imperium, the Emperor ends up explaining that knowledge without wisdom to limit it is dangerous, and so he bans battle psykers to Magnus's dismay. In his judgment, the Emperor sums up the exact problem with Magnus's position. He explains that basing your knowledge on the warp is dangerous, and without true knowledge and wisdom, one will become reckless. Okay, that's good and all, but Russ doesn't think his rune priests are bad. Why is that? Well, it's because the rune priests objectively do not engage with what Magnus was proposing, and we will be explaining that here today. If you remember, in the intro, we talked about how many fans reject world spirits as cope. Personally, I think this is because they are either ignorant of the nuance at play, or they just don't like that Magnus was double wrong with what he did. For a while, I'm sure world spirits were fairly esoteric pieces of lore that many people didn't know about, so we will cover how they work, and ideally with this newly gained understanding of one of Warhammer's more esoteric cosmological elements, we can further explain the nuance of Magnus's folly. In several instances, we are told that the practices of the Stormseers of the White Scars and the Rune Priests of Fenris do not draw upon the warp freely, but rather use the wisdom and tradition of their planet's culture as a safeguard, just like the Emperor talked about. We see in Scars that Ahriman's theories of the benign ether were rejected by the White Scars Legion and were explicitly replaced with the careful usage of the warp via culture and heritage of Chigoris, never dipping below the surface. It is then said that the Librarius was meant to control the powers of the Psyker Astartes and not extend them. Similarly, when Lorgar tries to call out Russ on his hypocrisy in A Thousand Suns, Russ explains that the power of the Rune Priest is clean and comes from Fenris, as opposed to raw-dogging the warp like I raw-dog your mom, pointing out that the power is explicitly devoid of the corruption the Thousand Suns have. These two beliefs are then further proven when we see Alpha Primus and Genefather explain that the collective cultures of these planets creates a sort of insulated bubble in the warp for psykers of the Legion to draw from and mitigate the risk of their psychic powers. He includes Blood Angels as a user of this technique, along with the aforementioned Space Wolves. A common counter-argument to this is citing Ahriman's duel with Weirdmake in A Thousand Suns. However, even in this duel, it is basically just Ahriman refusing to acknowledge the difference between drawing upon Fenris and raw-dogging the warp. Ahriman reasons that they're both just warp powers, right? And then perfectly illustrates why Magnus is so wrong and why Russ is fine with Rune Priest, as Weirdmake ends up being fed to demons by Ahriman. Jeez, who would have saw that coming? This sort of reasoning is also presented in the novel Wolfsbane when Dorn tries to raise the criticism against Russ, and then Russ and the Khan explain that, again, they do not draw upon the warp with no limits and use the limits of human wisdom to temper that power and avoid corruption. This would again be in line with what the Emperor said on Nikea, and despite that, Dorn attempts to then say that the Emperor outlawed similar practices on other planets, but the two Primarchs respond that the Emperor being vague as he was in the first place is what got them into this mess. I feel with these quotes it is pretty obvious that Russ is not a hypocrite and is in fact following what the Emperor said on Nikea, but let's take it a step further and explain just how wrong Magnus really was. In the Horus Heresy Black Book Inferno, we are told that because the Emperor is so strong of a psyker, he is able to explore the warp without limits. This is probably one of the only useful, unique pieces of information from the Black Books, as most of the time they play this weird game of records say, but none can know. This essentially relegates them to any diligent researcher as an official Wikipedia entry that just makes you go read the novels to see what actually happened. Nevertheless, we would see this bit of information reinforced by Korax when he visits the Gene Vaults in Deliverance Lost. He reasons that the Emperor would protect any psychers on Terra from corruption, especially with something as mundane as opening a lock. Another time this is proven is within the novel Prospero Burns. During the Council of Nikea, Amon claims that the Thousand Sons have mastered the warp, and surely it must be jealousy that is causing the other legions to vote against them. As we know, this is pure hubris, just like the Emperor would predict. This is made evident by the Crimson King, where we see a shard of Magnus take Amon on a flight within the Great Ocean, just like they used to back in the good old days. And Magnus being so strong meant they were untouched by the demons of the warp. When the shard begins to falter, we see Amon subjected to absolute terror as the predators begin to circle. He compares this to what happened when a neophyte travels too deeply. If at this point in the video this isn't a massive red flag, I don't know what else would be. Following this, the shard then disappears and darkness falls upon Amon, a fate that would befall anyone who wasn't Magnus or the Emperor. As we can see here, the limitless freedom Magnus preaches does not work for Astartes. It is not a workable philosophy. If you remember when I mentioned the Rune Priest Weird Make, well, we are told that in A Thousand Suns he would have to explain to Ahriman how runes work, with the whole not possessing power, etc., only for Ahriman to show off the psychic followers of the Thousand Suns. Having such a follower is so unthinkable to any other psyker, the encounter kind of reads as a joke, as if you saw someone trying to microwave a fork. To then add even more salt into the wound, it should be known that the two Primarchs who helped Magnus establish the librarians in the first place, the Khan and Sanguinius, were using world spirits anyways, making them by proxy look worse because of Magnus's tone-deaf support of absolute freedom. With all this information out there, it should be fairly apparent that Russ himself is logically consistent, and it is the fans' representation of Russ that would be the inconsistent one, not only with the lore, but logically as well. This isn't to say that Russ is innocent. In Wolvesbane, he fully admits that he is partially wrong in how he handled the censure of Magnus, due in part to Horus manipulating him, trying to get Magnus off the board. Gilliman would also reach this conclusion in Know No Fear, when he would say that the legions ridding themselves of their best weapon against demons was almost as if someone knew. In Jagatai Khan, Warhawk of Chagoras, Sanguinius would then speculate that if Horus weighed in on the matter, it could swing the council in favor of a Librarius, with the Lupercal star shining the brightest. In Galaxy in Flames, Horus would go on to say that Magnus is a threat second only to the Emperor, and in Scars, the Khan thought that Magnus losing to the Wolves would make the galaxy a warped place. Despite being at fault for the mishandling of Magnus, Russ does remain logically consistent in condemning the freedom that Magnus wanted. I would now like to address some of the common reservations people have about the whole Nikea situation. The first being, didn't the Emperor build a prison to hold Magnus so he could force him onto the Golden Throne? So if we actually read into the prison, called the White Mountain, as it is featured in the novel, The Buried Dagger, we see that the prison was made as a sort of worst-case scenario converted from a base used in the Unification Wars. The language used in the novel implies that it was made after Magnus's folly and not before, more specifically how it is referred to as a contingency plan. The second part of the claim is that Magnus would have been forced to sit on the throne is a bit misleading. So there is a quote in A Thousand Suns that does show Magnus suffering on the throne, and yes, that would have happened, but if and only if Magnus went through with his big mistake. In almost any other scenario where the Webway project is intact and Magnus returns to Terra, the Golden Throne would have been given to him as a gift. The ultimate gift for the Cyclops would be a throne that let him scry the warp freely. This is further reinforced by another quote in A Thousand Suns, and we also have it told to us in The End in the Death Volume 1, that aside from regulating the Webway that Magnus messed up, the Golden Throne is like the ultimate scrying device, granting Malkador near omniscience. The Golden Throne would be a reward, far better than the mechanism Magnus requested Perturabo build for him. In conclusion, I think the inclusion of world spirits makes the whole librarian crisis a lot more interesting of a subject, and especially with the information the novels provide, it becomes a rich piece of world building. While it's understandable that someone might only be familiar with the rudimentary telling of events you would find in Index Astartes or Visions of Heresy, I would hope that anyone truly invested into 40K would investigate how these events were extrapolated upon with the newer and honestly better tellings of the heresy. I think what we have in current day is a much more interesting and nuanced version of events. Saying lol Psyker's bad, Russ Hypocrite doesn't really do anything for the mythos at large. It really just makes a whole legion the butt of a joke, and in my opinion undersells their place in the heresy. it also kind of completely ignores the White Scars and Blood Angels who kind of do the same thing. Like, imagine it's the late 2000s and you learn that the heresy is getting expanded into novels and we get A Thousand Suns. Did you really expect the story would just be, yes, Russ is a massive hypocrite and there's absolutely nothing wrong with battle psychers whatsoever? Get real, the writing was always on the wall, like there are implications of world spirits as far back as 3rd edition. Overall, using the nuanced view of the heresy I have presented adds an ironic twist to Fury of Magnus, where Magnus is hit not by the sorcery that he got banned, but rather by the ancient and powerful spirit of Terra, rebuking him in his demonic form just like his father would have all those years back at Nikea. Anyways, that's it for the video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.